Chapter 1. The Extent of the Empire in the Age of the Antonines. Part 3. The camp of a Roman legion presented the appearance of a fortified city. As soon as the space was marked out, the pioneers carefully leveled the ground and removed every impediment that might interrupt its perfect regularity. Its form was an exact quadrangle, and we may calculate that a square of about 700 yards was sufficient for the encampment of 20,000 Romans, though a similar number of our own troops would expose to the enemy a front of more than treble that extent. In the midst of the camp, the praetorium, or general's quarters, rose above the others. The cavalry, the infantry, and the auxiliaries occupied their respective stations. The streets were broad and perfectly straight, and a vacant space of 200 feet between the tents and the rampart. The rampart itself was usually 12 feet high, armed with a line of strong and intricate palisades and defended by a ditch of 12 feet in depth as well as in breadth. This important labor was performed by the hands of the legionaries themselves, to whom the use of the spade and the pickaxe was no less familiar than that of the sword or pilum. Active valor may often be the present of nature, but such patient diligence can be the fruit only of habit and discipline. Whenever the trumpet gave the signal of departure, the camp was almost instantly broke up, and the troops fell into their ranks without delay or confusion. Besides their arms, which the legionaries scarcely considered as an encumbrance, they were laden with their kitchen furniture, instruments of fortification, and the provision of many days. Under this weight, which would oppress the delicacy of a modern soldier, they were trained by a regular step to advance in about 6 hours near 20 miles. On the appearance of an enemy, they threw aside their baggage, and by easy and rapid evolutions converted the column of march into an order of battle. The slingers and archers skirmished in the front, the auxiliaries formed the first line, and were seconded or sustained by the strength of the legions. The cavalry covered the flanks, and the military engines were placed in the rear. Such were the arts of war by which the Roman emperors defended their extensive conquests and preserved a military spirit at a time when every other virtue was oppressed by luxury and despotism. If, in the consideration of their armies, we pass from their discipline to their numbers, we shall not find it easy to define them with any tolerable accuracy. We may compute, however, that the legion, which was itself a body of 6,831 Romans, might, with its attendant auxiliaries, amount to about 12,500 men. The peace establishment of Hadrian and his successors was composed of no less than 30 of these formidable brigades, and most probably formed a standing force of 375,000 men. Instead of being confined within the walls of fortified cities, which the Romans considered as the refuge of weakness or pusillanimity, the legions were encamped on the banks of the great rivers and along the frontiers of the barbarians. As their stations for the most part remained fixed and permanent, we may venture to describe the distribution of the troops. 3 legions were sufficient for Britain. The principal strength lay upon the Rhine and Danube, and consisted of 16 legions in the following proportions: 2 in the Lower and 3 in the Upper Germany, 1 in Raetia, 1 in Noricum, 4 in Pannonia, 3 in Marcia, and 2 in Dacia. The defense of the Euphrates was entrusted to 8 legions, 6 of whom were planted in Syria, and the other 2 in Cappadocia. With regard to Egypt, Africa, and Spain, as they were far removed from any important scene of war, a single legion maintained the domestic tranquility of each of those great provinces. Even Italy was not left destitute of a military force. Above 20,000 chosen soldiers, distinguished by the titles of city cohorts and praetorian guards, watched over the safety of the monarch and the capital. As the authors of almost every revolution that distracted the empire, the praetorians will, very soon and very loudly, demand our attention. But in their arms and institutions we cannot find any circumstance which discriminated them from the legions, unless it were a more splendid appearance and a less rigid discipline. The navy maintained by the emperors might seem inadequate to their greatness, but it was fully sufficient for every useful purpose of government. The ambition of the Romans was confined to the land. nor was that warlike people ever actuated by the enterprising spirit which had prompted the navigators of Tyre, of Carthage, and even of Marseille to enlarge the bounds of the world and to explore the most remote coasts of the ocean. To the Romans, the ocean remained an object of terror rather than of curiosity. The whole extent of the Mediterranean, after the destruction of Carthage and the extirpation of the pirates, was included within their provinces. The policy of the emperors was directed only to preserve the peaceful dominion of that sea and to protect the commerce of their subjects. With these moderate views, Augustus stationed 2 permanent fleets in the most convenient ports of Italy, the one at Ravenna on the Adriatic, the other at Misenum in the Bay of Naples. Experience seems at length to have convinced the ancients that as soon as their galleys exceeded 2 or at the most 3 ranks of oars, they were suited rather for vain pomp than for real service. Augustus himself, in the victory of Actium, had seen the superiority of his own light frigates. They were called Liburnians over the lofty but unwieldy castles of his rival. Of these Liburnians he composed the 2 fleets of Ravenna and Misenum, destined to command, the one the eastern, the other the western division of the Mediterranean, and to each of the squadrons he attached a body of several thousand marines. Besides these 2 ports, which may be considered as the principal seats of the Roman navy, a very considerable force was stationed at Frejus, on the coast of Provence, and the Euxine was guarded by 40 ships and 3,000 soldiers. To all these we add the fleet which preserved the communication between Gaul and Britain, and a great number of vessels constantly maintained on the Rhine and Danube to harass the country or to intercept the passage of the barbarians. If we review this general state of the imperial forces, of the cavalry as well as infantry, of the legions, the auxiliaries, the guards, and the navy, the most liberal computation will not allow us to fix the entire establishment by sea and by land. At more than 450,000 men, a military power which, however formidable it may seem, was equalled by a monarch of the last century whose kingdom was confined within a single province of the Roman Empire, we have attempted to explain the spirit which moderated and the strength which supported the power of Hadrian and the Antonines. We shall now endeavor with clearness and precision to describe the provinces once united under their sway, but at present divided into so many independent and hostile states. Spain, the western extremity of the empire, of Europe, and of the ancient world, has, in every age, invariably preserved the same natural limits: the Pyrenean mountains, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic Ocean. That great peninsula, at present so unequally divided between 2 sovereigns, was distributed by Augustus into 3 provinces: Lusitania, Baetica, and Tarraconensis. The kingdom of Portugal now fills the place of the warlike country of the Lusitanians, and the loss sustained by the former on the side of the east is compensated by an accession of territory towards the north. The confines of Granada and Andalusia correspond with those of ancient Baetica. The remainder of Spain, Galicia, and the Asturias, Biscay and Navarre, Leon and the 2 Castiles, Murcia, Valencia, Catalonia, and Aragon all contributed to form the 3rd and most considerable of the Roman governments, which, from the name of its capital, was styled the province of Tarragona. Of the native barbarians, the Celtiberians were the most powerful, as the Cantabrians and Asturians proved the most obstinate. Confident in the strength of their mountains, they were the last who submitted to the arms of Rome, and the first who threw off the yoke of the Arabs. Ancient Gaul, as it contained the whole country between the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Rhine, and the ocean, was of greater extent than modern France. To the dominions of that powerful monarchy, with its recent acquisitions of Alsace and Lorraine, we must add the Duchy of Savoy, the cantons of Switzerland, the 4 electorates of the Rhine, and the territories of Liège, Luxembourg, Hainault, Flanders, and Brabant. When Augustus gave laws to the conquests of his father, he introduced a division of Gaul, equally adapted to the progress of the legions, to the course of the rivers, and to the principal national distinctions which had comprehended above 100 independent states. The sea coast of the Mediterranean, Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphiné, received their provincial appellation from the colony of Narbonne. The government of Aquitaine was extended from the Pyrenees to the Loire. The country between the Loire and the Seine was styled the Celtic Gaul, and soon borrowed a new denomination from the celebrated colony of Lugdunum or Lyons. The Belgic lay beyond the Seine, and in more ancient times had been bounded only by the Rhine. But a little before the age of Caesar, the Germans, abusing their superiority of valor, had occupied a considerable portion of the Belgic territory. The Roman conquerors very eagerly embraced so flattering a circumstance, and the Gallic frontier of the Rhine, from Basel to Leiden, received the pompous names of the Upper and the Lower Germany. Such, under the reign of the Antonines, were the 6 provinces of Gaul, the Narbonnese, Aquitaine, the Celtic, or Lyonnese, the Belgic, and the 2 Germanies. We have already had occasion to mention the conquest of Britain, and to fix the boundary of the Roman province in this island. It comprehended all England, Wales, and the lowlands of Scotland, as far as the friths of Dumbarton and Edinburgh. Before Britain lost her freedom, the country was irregularly divided between 30 tribes of barbarians, of whom the most considerable were the Belgae in the west, the Brigantes in the north, the Silures in South Wales, and the Iceni in Norfolk and Suffolk. As far as we can either trace or credit the resemblance of manners and language, Spain, Gaul, and Britain were peopled by the same hardy race of savages. Before they yielded to the Roman arms, they often disputed the field, and often renewed the contest. After their submission, they constituted the western division of the European provinces, which extended from the columns of Hercules to the wall of Antoninus, and from the mouth of the Tagus to the sources of the Rhine and Danube. The Ligurians dwelt on the rocky coast which now forms the Republic of Genoa. Venice was yet unborn, but the territories of that state which lie to the east of the Adige were inhabited by the Venetians. The middle part of the peninsula, that now composes the Duchy of Tuscany and the ecclesiastical state, was the ancient seat of the Etruscans and Umbrians, to the former of whom Italy was indebted for the first rudiments of civilized life. The Tiber rolled at the foot of the 7 hills of Rome, and the country of the Sabines, the Latins, and the Volsci, from that river to the frontiers of Naples, was the theatre of her infant victories. On that celebrated ground the first consuls deserved triumphs. Their successors adorned villas, and their posterity have erected convents. Capua and Campania possessed the immediate territory of Naples. The rest of the kingdom was inhabited by many warlike nations, the Marsi, the Samnites, the Apurians, and the Lucanians, and the seacoasts had been covered by the flourishing colonies of the Greeks. We may remark that when Augustus divided Italy into 11 regions, the little province of Istria was annexed to that seat of Roman sovereignty. The European provinces of Rome were protected by the course of the Rhine and the Danube. The latter of those mighty streams, which rises at the distance of only 30 miles from the former, flows above 1,300 miles, for the most part to the southeast, collects the tribute of 60 navigable rivers, and is at length through 6 mouths received into the Euxine, which appears scarcely equal to such an accession of waters. The provinces of the Danube soon acquired the general appellation of Illyricum, or the Illyrian frontier, and were esteemed the most warlike of the empire. But they deserve to be more particularly considered under the names of Raetia, Noricum, Pannonia, Dalmatia, Dacia, Marcia, Thrace, Macedonia, and Greece. The province of Raetia, which soon extinguished the name of the Vindelicians, extended from the summit of the Alps to the banks of the Danube, from its source as far as its conflux with the Inn. The greatest part of the flat country is subject to the Elector of Bavaria. The city of Augsburg is protected by the constitution of the German Empire. The Grisons are safe in their mountains, and the country of Tyrol is ranked among the numerous provinces of the House of Austria. The wide extent of territory which is included between the Inn, the Danube, and the Save, Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, the Lower Hungary, and Sclavonia, was known to the ancients under the names of Noricum and Pannonia. In their original state of independence, their fierce inhabitants were intimately connected. Under the Roman government, they were frequently united, and they still remain the patrimony of a single family. They now contain the residence of a German prince who styles himself Emperor of the Romans and form the center as well as strength of the Austrian power. It may not be improper to observe that if we accept Bohemia, Moravia, the northern skirts of Austria, and a part of Hungary between the Theiss and the Danube, all the other dominions of the House of Austria were comprised within the limits of the Roman Empire. Dalmatia, to which the name of Illyricum more properly belonged, was a long but narrow tract between the Save and the Adriatic. The best part of the sea coast, which still retains its ancient appellation, is a province of the Venetian state and the seat of the little republic of Ragusa. The inland parts have assumed the Sclavonian names of Croatia and Bosnia. The former obeys an Austrian governor, the latter a Turkish pacha, but the whole country is still infested by tribes of barbarians whose savage independence irregularly marks the doubtful limit of the Christian and Mahometan power. After the Danube had received the waters of the Theiss and the Save, it acquired, at least among the Greeks, the name of Istar. It formerly divided Masia and Dacia, the latter of which, as we have already seen, was a conquest of Trajan, and the only province beyond the river. If we inquire into the present state of those countries, we shall find that, on the left hand of the Danube, Temswa and Transylvania have been annexed after many revolutions to the crown of Hungary, whilst the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia acknowledge the supremacy of the Ottoman Porte. On the right hand of the Danube, Masia, which during the Middle Ages was broken into the barbarian kingdoms of Servia and Bulgaria, is again united in Turkish slavery. The appellation of Rumelia, which is still bestowed by the Turks on the extensive countries of Thrace, Macedonia, and Greece, preserves the memory of their ancient state under the Roman Empire. In the time of the Antonines, the martial regions of Thrace, from the mountains of Hamus and Rhodope to the Bosphorus and the Hellespont, had assumed the form of a province. Notwithstanding the change of masters and of religion, the new city of Rome, founded by Constantine on the banks of the Bosphorus, has ever since remained the capital of a great monarchy. The kingdom of Macedonia, which, under the reign of Alexander, gave laws to Asia, derived more solid advantages from the policy of the two Philips, and with its dependencies of Epirus and Thessaly, extended from the Aegean to the Ionian Sea. When we reflect on the fame of Thebes and Argos, of Sparta and Athens, we can scarcely persuade ourselves that so many immortal republics of ancient Greece were lost in a single province of the Roman Empire, which, from the superior influence of Achaean League, was usually denominated the province of Achaia. Such was the state of Europe under the Roman emperors. The provinces of Asia, without excepting the transient conquests of Trajan, are all comprehended within the limits of the Turkish power. But, instead of following the arbitrary divisions of despotism and ignorance, it will be safer for us, as well as more agreeable, to observe the indelible characters of nature. The name of Asia Minor is attributed with some propriety to the peninsula, which, confined betwixt the Euxine and the Mediterranean, advances from the Euphrates towards Europe. The most extensive and flourishing district westward of Mount Taurus and the river Halys was dignified by the Romans with the exclusive title of Asia. The jurisdiction of that province extended over the ancient monarchies of Troy, Lydia, and Phrygia, the maritime countries of the Pamphylians, Lycians, and Carians, and the Grecian colonies of Ionia, which equaled in arts, though not in arms, the glory of their parent. The kingdoms of Bithynia and Pontus possessed the northern side of the peninsula from Constantinople to Trebizond. On the opposite side, the province of Cilicia was terminated by the mountains of Syria. The inland country, separated from the Roman Asia by the river Halys and from Armenia by the Euphrates, had once formed the independent kingdom of Cappadocia. In this place we may observe that the northern shores of the Euxine, beyond Trebizond in Asia and beyond the Danube in Europe, acknowledged the sovereignty of the emperors and received at their hands either tributary princes or Roman garrisons. Budzak, Crim Tartary, Circassia, and Mingrelia are the modern appellations of those savage countries. Under the successors of Alexander, Syria was the seat of the Seleucidae, who reigned over Upper Asia till the successful revolt of the Parthians confined their dominions between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. When Syria became subject to the Romans, it formed the eastern frontier of their empire. nor did that province, in its utmost latitude, know any other bounds than the mountains of Cappadocia to the north, and towards the south the confines of Egypt and the Red Sea. Phoenicia and Palestine were sometimes annexed to, and sometimes separated from, the jurisdiction of Syria. The former of these was a narrow and rocky coast. The latter was a territory scarcely superior to Wales, either in fertility or extent. Yet Phoenicia and Palestine will forever live in the memory of mankind, since America, as well as Europe, has received letters from the one and religion from the other. A sandy desert, alike destitute of wood and water, skirts along the doubtful confine of Syria from the Euphrates to the Red Sea. The wandering life of the Arabs was inseparably connected with their independence, and wherever, on some spots less barren than the rest, they ventured to for many settled habitations, they soon became subjects to the Roman Empire. In regard to Phoenicia and Palestine, this comparison is exaggerated, with the intention, no doubt, of attacking the authority of the Bible, which boasts of the fertility of Palestine. Gibbon's only authorities were that of Strabo L. 16, 11-4, and the present state of the country. But Strabo only speaks of the neighborhood of Jerusalem, which he calls barren and arid to the extent of 60 stadia round the city. In other parts he gives a favorable testimony to the fertility of many parts of Palestine. Thus he says, near Jericho there is a grove of palms, and a country of 100 stadia, full of springs and well peopled. Moreover, Strabo had never seen Palestine. He spoke only after reports, which may be as inaccurate as those according to which he has composed. That description of Germany, in which Gluvarius has detected so many errors, Gluf, Germ, 3, 1, finally, his testimony is contradicted and refuted by that of other ancient authors and by medals. Tacitus says, in speaking of Palestine, the inhabitants are healthy and robust, the rains moderate, the soil fertile. Hist. V. 6. Ammianus Marcellinus says also, the last of the Syrias is Palestine, a country of considerable extent, abounding in clean and well-cultivated land, and containing some fine cities, none of which yields to the other, but, as it were, being on a parallel are rivals. 14.8. See also the historian Josephus Hist. by 1. Procopius of Caesarea, who lived in the 6th century, says that Chosroes, king of Persia, had a great desire to make himself master of Palestine, on account of its extraordinary fertility, its opulence, and the great number of its inhabitants. The Saracens thought the same, and were afraid that Omar, when he went to Jerusalem, charmed with the fertility of the soil and the purity of the air, would never return to Medina. Oakley Hist. of Serach I. 2040. The importance attached by the Romans to the conquest of Palestine and the obstacles they encountered prove also the richness and population of the country. Vespasian and Titus caused medals to be struck with trophies, in which Palestine is represented by a female under a palm tree, to signify the richness of he country, with this legend, Judeo-Capta. Other medals also indicate this fertility, for instance, that of Herod holding a bunch of grapes, and that of the young Agrippa displaying fruit. As to the present state of he country, one perceives that it is not fair to draw any inference against its ancient fertility. The disasters through which it has passed, the government to which it is subject, the disposition of the inhabitants, explain sufficiently the wild and uncultivated appearance of the land, where, nevertheless, fertile and cultivated districts are still found, according to the testimony of travelers, among others of Shaw, Mondru, La Roque, and C. G. The Abbé Guénet, in his Lettres de quelques Juifs à Mons, de Voltaire has exhausted the subject of the fertility of Palestine, for Voltaire had likewise indulged in sarcasm on this subject. Gibbon was assailed on this point, not, indeed, by Mr. Davis, who, he slyly insinuates, was prevented by his patriotism as a Welshman from resenting the comparison with Wales, but by other writers. In his vindication, he first established the correctness of his measurement of Palestine, which he estimates as 7,600 square English miles, while Wales is about 70 and 11. As to fertility, he proceeds in the following dexterously composed and splendid passage. The Emperor Frederick II, the enemy and the victim of the clergy, is accused of saying after his return from his crusade that the God of the Jews would have despised his promised land if he had once seen the fruitful realms of Sicily and Naples. Si Gianone isto cibi del R di Napoli 2, 2045. This raillery, which Malice has perhaps falsely imputed to Frederick, is inconsistent with truth and piety. Yet it must be confessed that the soil of Palestine does not contain that inexhaustible and, as it were, spontaneous principle of fertility, which, under the most unfavorable circumstances, has covered with rich harvests the banks of the Nile, the fields of Sicily, or the plains of Poland. The Jordan is the only navigable river of Palestine. A considerable part of the narrow space is occupied, or rather lost, in the Dead Sea, whose horrid aspect inspires every sensation of disgust and countenances every tale of horror. The districts which border on Arabia partake of the sandy quality of the adjacent desert. The face of the country, except the seacoast and the valley of the Jordan, is covered with mountains which appear, for the most part, as naked and barren rocks, and in the neighborhood of Jerusalem there is a real scarcity of the two elements of earth and water. See Maundrell's Travels, p. 65, and Rieland's Palestine, I. 23.8, 3095. These disadvantages, which now operate in their fullest extent, were formerly corrected by the labors of a numerous people and the active protection of a wise government. The hills were clothed with rich beds of artificial mold, the rain was collected in vast cisterns, a supply of fresh water was conveyed by pipes and aqueducts to the dry lands. The breed of cattle was encouraged in those parts which were not adapted for tillage, and almost every spot was compelled to yield some production for the use of the inhabitants. Pater specolendi hod facilem esse viam voluit primusc par artem movit agros, curis aquens mortalia corda, nec torpere gravi passus sua regna veterno. Gibbon misc. Works 4, 500. But Gibbon has here eluded the question about the land flowing with milk and honey. He is describing Judea only, without comprehending Galilee or the rich pastures beyond the Jordan, even now proverbial for their flocks and herds. See Burckhardt's Travels and Hist of Jews, I-178. The following is believed to be a fair statement. The extraordinary fertility of the whole country must be taken into the account. No part was waste. Very little was occupied by unprofitable wood. The more fertile hills were cultivated in artificial terraces. Others were hung with orchards of fruit trees. The more rocky and barren districts were covered with vineyards. Even in the present day, the wars and misgovernment of ages have not exhausted the natural richness of the soil. Galilee, says Moltebrun, would be a paradise were it inhabited by an industrious people under an enlightened government. No land could be less dependent on foreign importation. It bore within itself everything that could be necessary for the subsistence and comfort of a simple agricultural people. The climate was healthy, the seasons regular, the former rains, which fell about October after the vintage, prepared the ground for the seed. That latter, which prevailed during March and the beginning of April, made it grow rapidly. Directly the rains ceased, the grain ripened with still greater rapidity and was gathered in before the end of May. The summer months were dry and very hot, but the nights cool and refreshed by copious dews. In September the vintage was gathered. Grain of all kinds, wheat, barley, millet, zea, and other sorts, grew in abundance. The wheat commonly yielded 30 for 1. Besides the vine and the olive, the almond, the date, figs of many kinds, the orange, the pomegranate, and many other fruit trees flourished in the greatest luxuriance. Great quantity of honey was collected. The balm tree, which produced the opobalsamum, a great object of trade, was probably introduced from Arabia in the time of Solomon. It flourished about Jericho and in Gilead. Milman's Hist of Jews, I. 77. M. The geographers of antiquity have frequently hesitated to what portion of the globe they should ascribe Egypt. By its situation, the celebrated kingdom is included within the immense peninsula of Africa, but it is accessible only on the side of Asia, whose revolutions in almost every period of history Egypt has humbly obeyed. A Roman prefect was seated on the splendid throne of the Ptolemies, and the iron scepter of the Mamelukes is now in the hands of a Turkish pacha. The Nile flows down the country about 500 miles from the Tropic of Cancer to the Mediterranean, and marks on either side the extent of fertility by the measure of its inundations. Cyrene, situate towards the west and along the seacoast, was first a Greek colony, afterwards a province of Egypt, and is now lost in the desert of Barca. Addendum Ptolemy and Strabo, with the modern geographers, fix the Isthmus of Suez as the boundary of Asia and Africa. Dionysius, Mela, Pliny, Sallust, Hirtius, and Solinus have preferred for that purpose the western branch of the Nile, or even the great Catabathmus or descent, which last would assign to Asia not only Egypt, but part of Libya. Addendum The French editor has a long and unnecessary note on the history of Cyrene. For the present state of that coast and country, the volume of Captain Beechey is full of interesting details. Egypt, now an independent and improving kingdom, appears, under the enterprising rule of Muhammad Ali, likely to revenge its former oppression upon the decrepit power of the Turkish Empire. This note was written in 1838. The future destiny of Egypt is an important problem, only to be solved by time. This observation will also apply to the new French colony in Algiers, Next, 1845. From Cyrene to the ocean, the coast of Africa extends above 1,500 miles, yet so closely is it pressed between the Mediterranean and the Sahara, or sandy desert, that its breadth seldom exceeds 80 or 100 miles. The eastern division was considered by the Romans as the more peculiar and proper province of Africa. Till the arrival of the Phoenician colonies, that fertile country was inhabited by the Libyans, the most savage of mankind. Under the immediate jurisdiction of Carthage, it became the center of commerce and empire, but the Republic of Carthage is now degenerated into the feeble and disorderly states of Tripoli and Tunis. The military government of Algiers oppresses the wide extent of Numidia, as it was once united under Massinissa and Jugurtha. But in the time of Augustus, the limits of Numidia were contracted, and at least 2/3 of the country acquiesced in. The name of Mauritania, with the epithet of Caesariensis, the genuine Mauritania, or country of the Moors, which, from the ancient city of Tingi or Tangier, was distinguished by the appellation of Tingitana, is represented by the modern kingdom of Fez. Sal on the ocean, so infamous at present for its piratical depredations, was noticed by the Romans as the extreme object of their power and almost of their geography. A city of their foundation may still be discovered near Mequinez, the residence of the barbarian whom we condescend to style the Emperor of Morocco, but it does not appear that his more southern dominions, Morocco itself and Segomessa, were ever comprehended within the Roman province. The western parts of Africa are intersected by the branches of Mount Atlas, a name so idly celebrated by the fancy of poets, but which is now diffused over the immense ocean that rolls between the ancient and the new continent. Having now finished the circuit of the Roman Empire, we may observe that Africa is divided from Spain by a narrow strait of about 12 miles, through which the Atlantic flows into the Mediterranean. The columns of Hercules, so famous among the ancients, were two mountains which seem to have been torn asunder by some convulsion of the elements, and at the foot of the European mountain the fortress of Gibraltar is now seated. The whole extent of the Mediterranean Sea, its coasts and its islands, were comprised within the Roman dominion. Of the larger islands, the two Baleares, which derive their name of Majorca and Minorca from their respective size, are subject at present, the former to Spain, the latter to Great Britain. It is easier to deplore the fate than to describe the actual condition of Corsica. Two Italian sovereigns assume a regal title from Sardinia and Sicily. Crete, or Candia, with Cyprus, and most of the smaller islands of Greece and Asia have been subdued by the Turkish arms, whilst the little rock of Malta defies their power and has emerged, under the government of its military order, into fame and opulence. This long enumeration of provinces whose broken fragments have formed so many powerful kingdoms might almost induce us to forgive the vanity or ignorance of the ancients. Dazzled with the extensive sway, the irresistible strength, and the real or affected moderation of the emperors, they permitted themselves to despise and sometimes to forget the outlying countries which had been left in the enjoyment of a barbarous independence, and they gradually usurped the license of confounding the Roman monarchy with the globe of the earth. But the temper, as well as knowledge, of a modern historian require a more sober and accurate language. He may impress a juster image of the greatness of Rome by observing that the empire was above 2,000 miles in breadth, from the wall of Antoninus and the northern limits of Dacia to Mount Atlas and the Tropic of Cancer that it extended in, length more than 3,000 miles from the Western Ocean to the Euphrates, that it was situated in the finest part of the temperate zone, between the 24th and 56th degrees of northern latitude, and that it was supposed to contain above 1,600,000 square miles, for the most part of fertile and well-cultivated land.